Okay, I've been meaning to respond to some of the comments under my post. Let me start off by saying that um, the post was approved sometime after midnight Eastern time, and the admin Jacob Israel made some counter arguments and then suspended me from being able to respond immediately, right? Suspended me to protect himself from the what he knows is going to happen, which is that his arguments are silly and weak, and they're going to be taken care of pretty easily. So, anyway, my thesis, as I state in the article that I wrote, a little formal there, but anyway, whatever it was that I wrote, what I state is that the Jewish Israelite diaspora includes West and Central Africa. Okay, it's a very conservative position. I'm not sure why all these little people are so terrified, but that's all I'm saying. It includes West and Central Africa, and as such, Black Jews in the West who came through West and Central Africa, these people are making a very legitimate claim for Jewish identity. It's extremely plausible. It's a prima facie case that we can put on, and it's not particularly difficult to do so. I've presented in this group multiple sources and references showing that you had this historical presence of Israelites/Jews in West and Central Africa as early as Vespasian, 2,000 years, okay? One of the more, I would say, in terms of the latter end, the obvious answer would be when Jews were expelled from Iberia at the close of the 15th century. And there are recorded, there are records making it clear that some of these Jews were certainly sent us to West and Central Africa. And the question becomes then, these Jews in West and Central Africa, were they immune to the slave trade or were they not? Now, some people believe that, 90% or even more than that of the people who were caught up in that slave trade were these Jews. I don't necessarily believe that the percentage is that high, but I first of all would argue that statistics make it largely inevitable that you would have had many Jews swept up in that trade because they come from the exact regions where people were enslaved. More importantly, well, not more importantly, but I would also just add, I guess, that there's historical evidence that there were tough relationships between some of these Jewish communities and the surrounding ethnic West Africans and Central Africans. So it would stand to reason that when the slave trade began, that these groups would have been particularly vulnerable. I think an example would be the history of Dahomey and Ouida, and I understand that the Jewish identity of people in Ouida is something that's disputed. I think it's largely clear, but we'll put that aside for now, and I'll just suffice it to say that I believe that there were certainly Jews in Ouida/Judah, and that they were targeted by the kingdom of Dahomey. But anyway, let's deal with some of these counter arguments. I'm sorry, I missed some of the main points that I did make. I would just add, in terms of the main points, is that the main point I wanted to clarify is that what's happening in these discussions about DNA is people are challenging Black Jews in the West to prove that they're genetically Israelites, because when we take a DNA test, it doesn't say, hey, you're a Jew, or hey, you're 50% Jewish. We don't get those kinds of results. But what's not being discussed is the fact that the reason we don't get those results is because it is impossible to get those results. Here's why. Let's say you take an Ashkenazi Jew. An Ashkenazi Jew takes a test. I just read someone's comment on this. He took a test. It showed up 100% Ashkenazi Jew. He comes online and he says, hey, I don't have any goy in me. Here are my results. Now, I don't have an issue with it, but here's what he's missing. The results showing 100% Ashkenazi Jew does not mean that he is 100% genetically Jewish. All that means is that his DNA profile is 100% match for the genetic mosaic of Ashkenazi Jews. I say genetic mosaic because it's like a puzzle, you know, and there are different pieces of this puzzle. And obviously, with groups like an Ashkenazi, you know, the Ashkenazi Jewish community, there's going to be substantial European blood, right? Substantial European. So it doesn't mean that you have 100% Semitic DNA and certainly not 100% Jewish or Israelite DNA. It just means that you're a match for that population group, right? Same would apply to Sephardim. You know, to a lesser extent, the same applies to Jews in Southern Africa, like the Limba, or in Eastern Africa, like the Ethiopian Jew, okay? I say lesser extent because there's less study, there's less samples and stuff like that. Here's the problem though. Jews who came through West and Central Africa, we need to be included in these reference samples. If we're not included in these reference samples, it's not possible for us to be identified as Jewish. It's not, let me rephrase that. It's not possible for the DNA test to clearly identify us as Jewish under the admixture category. Okay, and right now it's admixture category. It's common in many tests, but you know, I use GED match a lot. But the bottom line is, yeah, you're not going to get that, right? Because what we are is we have what they refer to as sub-Saharan African DNA, right? Let's say West African DNA in particular. West African. So what happens is that even if myself and a given Ashkenazi Jew, even if we have the same ancestor going back, whatever, 50 generations, right? His blood is essentially Levantine, Semitic, you know, Jewish, whatever, right? And European. Mine is Levantine, Semitic, Jewish, and African. We both have other stuff in there, but those are the critical components. But because we're so different on account of me having black African DNA and him having white or pink European DNA, we're never gonna show up as a match. So we need to build our own unique genetic profile and make sure that that's included in these reference samples so that we can pop up. Now, what can we do in the meantime? In the meantime, there are certainly telltale signs. One telltale sign is simply if you have, and these are telltale signs for people who came through West and Central Africa, who are Jews, is that you're going to have sub-Saharan African DNA, but you're also going to have some degree of Mediterranean, Middle Eastern, Levantine DNA, this sort of thing, okay? Are there other potential explanations for that? Yeah, but that applies to any group of Jews, right? There's always potential alternative explanations as to why you have this Levantine DNA. But this brings me to my next point, which is that we have to focus on what the correct standard is. People are constantly asking us to prove with DNA, prove with DNA that we undoubtedly descend from an Iron Age population in the Levant. It's an absurd standard. No displaced group of people can prove definitively that they descend directly from an Iron Age population. It's not possible, and to the extent it would be possible, at a minimum you would need widespread, viable, verifiable, authentic DNA samples from ancient Israelites. And then we take those samples and we compare our own DNA with those. But we don't have that. So these requests and these demands that we produce that kind of evidence, it doesn't make any sense. It's absurd logically and scientifically. Outside of this Levantine plus SSA DNA, the other factor we want to look at is we can still use population comparisons. And so, for example, I have presented evidence that that on multiple GED match tests, Ethiopian Jew and Limba pops up. On the high end, 75%, 3 parts Limba, 1 part sub-Saharan African, right? Some particular group in sub-Saharan Africa, you know. And Ethiopian Jew, I think it was about a quarter, with the rest being Fang, you know. So why am I getting these hits for Ethiopian Jew and Limba, right? They're on the other end of the continent, you know. Ethiopian Jews obviously on the east side, the Limba on the southern side. Why am I getting those hits? I would argue because it suggests that the common denominator is this Jewish DNA. This idea that we have, black African DNA mixed with Levantine Jewish DNA. Lastly, I'll say that what they're doing, some of the practices that they employ are ridiculous. And one of these practices is they will take their DNA and they say, okay, listen, we understand your complaints about us using modern samples, which is circular. We understand that complaint. So what we want to do then, we're going to look at ancient DNA. So what they do, they go dig up a Canaanite somewhere, supposedly, right? They go dig up a Canaanite and they say, okay, our DNA is the same as this Hamite's DNA. So cool, we're good. This is foolishness, right? Now, I'm no scientist, but I'm just going to tell you, logically, you cannot prove that you descend from ancient Israelites by showing that your which are Semites, right? By showing that your DNA matches Hamite, Canaanite DNA. It doesn't make sense logically. You can't even make that argument based on other Shemites or Semites, right? But you certainly can't make that argument based on Hamites. It's absurd. Obviously there's what you call mutations that occur, over time. So we don't know how all these mutations have played out. And there's a strong body of evidence and scientific thought that argues that the way that we treat haplogroups are ridiculous. We ought not apply haplogroups to entire populations. We need to look at it more through the lens of particular families. There's just been so much admixture. So you find these people who argue that if your haplogroup is E1B1A, or if your haplogroup is a given subclade of E1B1A, then you necessarily cannot be descended from ancient Israelites. Nonsensical. These people have yet to produce a verified, confirmed, independently verifiable, by the way, confirmed body of ancient Israelite DNA, multiple, because you can always find a one-off in either direction, right? So you need enough for it to be statistically important, and the sample size has to be large enough. But they will not produce that, or certainly have not produced that. So no one can exclude a particular haplogroup from being genetically Israelite or descendant of ancient Israelites. They just don't have that ability. Okay, so I went on a little too long. I'll try to quickly burn through these counter arguments. So Jacob Israel says, you're clearly as ignorant as F about DNA because you make so many false assumptions about DNA. Point one, nobody proves that Jews were from ancient Israel by testing their DNA against their own DNA. This makes zero sense. So let me just address that. So he created his own straw man and then proceeded to try to burn it down, okay? I never said that a given Jewish person should test their DNA against their own DNA. No, I'm saying that the task for us is to take a modern Jew and you try to compare that DNA to ancient Israel. Now, so to the extent that he's denying that, I do want to clarify that. The other possible interpretation is maybe he's addressing when I talk about this idea that if you take an Ashkenazim, for example, and you test his blood, his DNA, and you say he's 100% DNA, that's based off of samples of modern day Ashkenazim. That's just a fact. So that's exactly how that process works. And he goes talking about ancient Levantine DNA, all about Near East. We don't need to have actual Israelite DNA because they are Semites. And yeah, I disagree with that. I disagree with that. You cannot prove, just think about it logically. It's not possible to prove somebody is an Israelite solely because they have Shemitic DNA, because you could be, for example, an Ishmaelite, right? So it's illogical for people to say this, all right? This guy doesn't know what he's talking about. I will give him this. He's more informed than some of the other people I've encountered in this group. I'll give him that. But ultimately, his arguments are silly. Here's the funniest argument. He says the other issue is that people have ancient DNA within their DNA, and this DNA survives for thousands of years. Now here we are. It gets funny. All people whose ancestors were in the ancient Near East have Neanderthal DNA because Neanderthals were in ancient Eurasia and even in Israel itself. Okay? Jews which he means when he says that he's talking about white Jews primarily. White Jews have this Neanderthal DNA, black Americans do not. That means your ancestors could not have been in ancient Israel, otherwise you also would have inherited the same Neanderthal DNA. And I want you to recognize how absolutely absurd this argument is. This man is arguing that the litmus test, or at least one litmus test, right, to determine Israelite identity is whether or not you have Neanderthal DNA. But he's arguing it in the opposite direction that people normally argue it. He's saying, hey, you cannot be a descendant of Avraham, Yitzchak, or Yaakov unless you have Neanderthal caveman DNA in you. This is the level of insanity these people are stooping to. This is not something that any rational person would say. It's not something that anyone would say who has any knowledge of DNA or genetics or what have you. It's just absurd on its face. One of the remarkable things about the Israelite/Jewish people is the fact that they were able to a large extent, and certainly up until certain points, preserve their genetic identity. Because there's a connection between genetic identity and cultural identity, and then the identity in the covenant, right? When you become too corrupted genetically, then it creates a whole host of other problems. That's a whole other topic, though, that's a little bit out left field. But the bottom line is that is nonsense. You do not have to have caveman or Neanderthal DNA in order to be an Israelite. This is what only someone who themselves descend from Neanderthals and cavemen would say something so utterly ridiculous. He goes on to say, lack of Natufian DNA, right? So he makes a claim. First of all, he claims he has 51% Natufian DNA by just posting a little screenshot there of a table. No name, no identifying information, no nothing, right? These guys don't have credibility, they're dishonest, most likely not true. But let's assume it is. The more important part is that he says that the average black American only has around 5% of Natufian DNA. And then he declares that in order to be descendant of ancient Israelites, you have to have at least 35% Natufian DNA. Now, first of all, he doesn't know what my Natufian DNA is, right? That's number one. Number two, who the hell is this guy to invent a magic number and say you have to have 35% Natufian DNA? And this is what these people don't understand. These commercial DNA tools, they skew heavily in favor of recent admixture, right? So let's just say hypothetically, if we actually had the body of an ancient Israelite, do you know how many people, and do you know how many authentic people who literally descend from that ancient Israelite would take a DNA test, and the amount of Israelite DNA would be minuscule? Right, because it fades. A lot of the commercial tools are only really accurate for about 6 to 8 generations. So this is why groups, for example, like Jews who had went into West Africa, this is why a lot of the genetic markers that relate or that we associate with Jewish or Israelite identity is essentially washed out by this Western African DNA that may or may not have the Jewish component in it. So this is why it's important for us to create the mosaics. Studies need to be done on these Jews who came through West Africa and Central Africa, and we need to create these reference samples that capture these blends, and then we know what to do with them. So anyway, no, the Natufian argument is weak because he hasn't supported it with anything. Now, if he can produce something credible and peer-reviewed and legitimate, saying that, hey, you can't be genetically Jewish unless you have 35% Natufian DNA, I'd be happy to consider it and evaluate it. I don't think these kinds of sources exist. I think he's just making up nonsense. The last thing is that he claims that nobody can tell the genetic identity of original Israelites, but then he says, but especially black Israelite Jewish people with direct lineage to ancient Israel. So he calls this a contradiction. He said, this BS essay shows the distorted mindset of these fakes because it's full of contradictions. Here's just one of them. So classic example, right? He claims there's multiple contradictions, but coincidentally, he's only got time for one, But anyway, he doesn't know what contradiction means, and or he's dishonest here as well, right? It is not a contradiction to say that nobody can tell the genetic identity of the original Israelites, meaning you don't have the samples. And then to also say that use this reference to black Israelites, Jewish people with direct lineage to ancient Israel. What he believes is that because DNA companies don't have, or at least allegedly don't have, samples, widespread samples of ancient Israelite DNA, he thinks that that fact contradicts with the claim of me stating that many black Israelites descend from ancient Israel. It's not a contradiction at all. What he really means to say is that, well, listen, if you don't have the original, these samples, then how do you know you descend? What he's saying really, but he doesn't realize it, he's just questioning how we can prove it. And that takes me back to one of my first points, was that we cannot, no group in 2026 can definitively prove, certainly no displaced group in 2026 can definitively prove that they descend directly from an Iron Age population 3,500 years ago. It's not possible. So again, what we're making are plausible claims. We don't have to jump through the loops for these random nobodies who also cannot prove definitively that they descend from ancient Israel. Like, who do these people think they are? No, they're trying to hold, if you're black and Jewish, they try to hold you to a different standard than everyone else. This is the extent of their narcissism, and it's actually ironic considering that the Israelites started out certainly as a black race of people. So if anyone were going to take that position, it should be black Israelites. And I understand Hebrew Israelites do take that position, that you have to be black in order to be Jewish or Israelite. I don't agree with that either, for the same reasons why I don't agree with it when it's coming from the white anti-Semites. But anyway, so weak arguments. Does he have anything else? Yeah, no. So basically weak arguments, a collection of weak arguments, claims of a contradiction that didn't occur. And he said, there's another one. He said that having 1 to 5% of your DNA from the Middle East Levant is not insignificant. It's not insignificant if your MENA-Levantine admixture appears. Okay, he says, how can it not be insignificant? Percentages are an amount based on 100. If you claim to have a direct lineage to ancient Israel, then how the F can you end up with only 1% of your DNA from that region? So classic ignorance. I kind of already addressed this, right? Second cousins share about 3% DNA, right? Each generation that passes, the DNA that you pull from that particular ancestor gets smaller and smaller and smaller. So those of us who believe in the Tanakh and place that above the oral tradition, we recognize that Israelite identity is a matter of patrilineal descent. So if I'm saying that I descend from the ancient Israelites, do you realize how much admixture has been in the picture? So even though I'm receiving that exact Y chromosome passed down through the centuries, factoring in whatever mutations may or may not have occurred, but I'm essentially receiving that same Y chromosome. What about all the other DNA that makes me me, coming from all these different groups potentially, right? Even if the Jews who went to West and Central Africa were endogamous, what would happen is that those who did get swept up in the slave trade, do you really think the endogamy would have continued? No, it wouldn't have continued. We would be dealing with a complete diverse group of people genetically. However, our claim is that we patrilineally descend from Israelites, and hence we are Israelites, and what's required of us now is to put back on our proper culture, our proper identity, our proper names, for lack of a better word, our proper religion, and to step back into our real identity as Israelites and to take that on. We don't become less Israelite or non-Israelite, solely because this percentage that they've identified as being Levantine DNA is small. The truth is, we don't know what an ancient Israelite would have showed. How do we know an ancient Israelite's DNA wouldn't show up as 5 or 10% Levantine? We don't know that. Let's not forget Israel was born in Africa. It was literally born in Mitzrayim, right? So how then can these people say definitively what kind of DNA these people have had. Consider the migrations. I personally believe, and I don't even think it's in dispute, certainly not among intellectuals who are non-racist, that North Africa, Middle East has always been full of black people. Even now, my subclade, my haplogroup, my paternal haplogroup subclade, when I go to Y-Tree, there are just as many samples in the Middle East as there are in West Africa. Why is that? So the bottom line is, we don't know what their profile looked like. These guys are assuming that their profile showed 100% Levantine. We have no idea. These were black people, as far as I know, and as far as the evidence that I've seen. So whatever their DNA profile was, if they took a test based on modern standards, it might very well show up as what they're referring to as sub-Saharan African. But this is what I will tell you. Take two Africans. Let's say we take a Nigerian, we take a Cameroonian. Those two Africans are more genetically, on average, are more genetically diverse or distinct from each other than either one of them are to a given guy in Ireland or freaking Norway. This is how genetically diverse so-called black people are. So there is no monolithic black race. It's actually a fiction. It doesn't exist. No, there are a series of different black groups and groups that happen to have other complexions, but the complexion is kind of irrelevant. What matters is the bloodline and the lineage. If I move to Sweden tomorrow and I take a second wife and she's Swedish, and we have a son and he takes a Swedish wife and so forth, 3-4 generations, our kid is going to be, my progeny is going to be indistinguishable from other Swedes. However, based on our view in terms of recognizing that Israelite identity is established patrilineally, my great-grandson, might even have blonde hair by then, my great-grandson is still going to be an Israelite. So we cannot jump to these conclusions and make these claims based solely on complexion. It's silly. It doesn't make any sense scientifically. Race is largely just a social construct. There are some scientific underpinnings, certain things that you might have in common, but overall, just because I am a dark-skinned black man does not mean that I am genetically the same as, I don't know, a Hausa or Igbo in Nigeria. It just doesn't mean that. We could be incredibly distinct, and in the past, people put way more focus on things like, the study of the cranium, the skull shapes and stuff, and facial structures. Some of these things are actually far more relevant and indicative of your ethnic identity than your actual complexion. So anyway, hopefully I cleared that up. Hopefully I get unblocked. If I'm honest, I don't care a whole lot. I find it amusing that they're so terrified of me that they're suspending me to stop me from responding to their silly arguments. But this is exactly why, we need to make sure we have our own voices, because these anti-Semites, they will do anything to erase black Jewish identity. And this is how we know these people are enemies to Israel and enemies to the restoration of Israel, enemies to the God of Israel, and they spit on the prophets who foretold of this restoration of Israel. They're trying to do everything in their power to obstruct it, but they're going to fail. They're going to fail. Peace.